Hello, everyone. So we definitely have quite a lot on the agenda, so we're gonna jump right into things. Welcome to our second annual symposium, now named the Anti-Oppression in Healthcare and Sciences Symposium. We are so proud of how much this symposium has grown in just 1 year. Last year, this symposium began as an initiative funded through the EDI Action Fund, granted by the wonderful Office of Inclusion and Diversity for the Temerty Faculty of Medicine. This truly wouldn't be possible without the support of the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. While this year's conference includes a name change, 2 days worth of presentations, and more opportunities for virtual engagement, our aim for the symposium remains the same. This symposium is an opportunity for students within the Temerty Faculty of Medicine who have been doing anti-oppression work to share research and other initiatives with the broader public. Anti-oppression work can sometimes feel isolating and daunting, especially when navigating through structures that have existed for so many decades, if not centuries. We hope for this symposium to inspire those of you who have not engaged in anti-oppression as yet to start, and for those of you who already have been, to continue doing so. As we learn more about what our colleagues and future health professionals have been doing to confront and dismantle oppressive structures and norms, remember that shared knowledge is power. Next slide. Great. So there's some logistics to keep in mind for today. First being that your video camera and profile picture are going to be turned off throughout the duration of the symposium. Second is that the chat function is only enabled to allow you to message the hosts and presenters. Third, please send your questions in the chat to Gagan for the upcoming panel. You'll be able to find him within the chat function. 4, we strive to create a safer, inclusive, anti-racist, welcoming space. Please be sure to engage in the question function respectfully and compassionately. 5th, refer to your symposium guide to review the full agenda. It contains the Zoom meeting details for concurrent sessions. And 6th, we welcome you to have a respectful conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #AntiOSymposium. So this is something also that's new for this year's symposium, and they're focus groups. If you are a UST student attending any portion of the symposium and you're interested in receiving a $10 gift card for participating in a focus group about the impact of the symposium on Saturday, March 13th, which is the second day of the symposium, and this will be taking place from 1:30 to 2:30, then please email Shannon. Her email is in the chat, as well as on the slide. So now I'll just briefly walk us through the agenda for today's sessions. We'll go through the rest of the opening remarks, including a land acknowledgement, then transition into a panel from 5:10 p.m. to 6 p.m. Then there'll be a series of presentations, and then closing remarks at 7:30. Note that there is a break scheduled for 6:45 p.m. There will be 2 points during today's sessions where we will have concurrent presentations. This will happen from 6 p.m. to 6:45 p.m. and then from 7 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. During those sessions, one presentation will be taking place in this room that you're in right now, as well as another session that's taking place in an alternate Zoom meeting. You should have received an email earlier today with a chart that shows you all of the potential Zoom links for the symposium, both today and tomorrow. You are provided with that link, as we were saying, in the Zoom meeting via the symposium brochure, and also it's on the Eventbrite page. So if you choose to watch the presentation happening in the alternate Zoom, just make sure to come back to the main Zoom if you are planning to watch the rest of the symposium, because we would love to see you back, just so that there are no technical difficulties. With that being said, now I would like to introduce Anita, the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Office of Inclusion and Diversity, for a land acknowledgement.
Thanks so much for that really great intro, Chantal. You took us through that really clearly, and I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free to message the host, as Shannon mentioned, as Chantal mentioned. So I get to start us off with a land acknowledgement, and I'd invite all of you to, as I'm reading out the land acknowledgement, to do your own reflection. These land acknowledgements tend to be very we're reading one out that's from U of T, that's created by the institution, but I will take a moment to reflect a bit after I've read it out. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the Faculty of Medicine operates. So for thousands and thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are really, really grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We want to recognize that we're gathered in an institution with a colonial history and that we should work to address ongoing colonial harms. Land acknowledgements are only a starting point for larger conversations, and more concrete acts of restitution and transformation are needed to address underlying inequities and blatant discrimination in the distribution of resources between Canada's First Peoples and settlers. So I'd like to thank the Centre for Faculty Development for helping to co-create part of this reflection. I'd also like to think about this land acknowledgement in the context of what we're here talking about today and discussing today, and all the listening and learning we're going to be doing today on anti-oppression based and equity-based research. So I had the chance recently to read a wonderful article that was created by one of the faculty's medical students, Sarah Hyatt, in collaboration with partners Stacey Margerison and Chelsea Gable. The article was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It's called Improving Health Research Among Indigenous Peoples in Canada. And they make some really important points about research and health research in particular. I'll quote directly from the article. Historically, owing to a dominant Western science paradigm, Indigenous methods, methodologies, epistemologies, knowledge, and perspectives have been dismissed as unsuitable for health research. As such, Indigenous health research frequently remains poorly aligned with the goals and values of Indigenous peoples. And furthermore, research involving Indigenous peoples has been tainted by historical atrocities. The process of reconciliation in Canada should include the indigenization of health research, which will contribute to deconstruction of colonial control. So I leave you with that reflection and acknowledgement to think about the territories that you're on, depending on where you're dialing in from today. We're all in this virtual world right now. So just taking a moment to think about that and your own social location and location to the land. So thanks very much for listening to that. I'd now like to I'm very excited to introduce the mini panel on engaging community in creating sustainable change. So we are privileged to have two wonderful speakers with us today. The first speaker is Dr. Nanki Rai, who is trained in public health and works as a family physician at the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center. She's also the 2S LGBTQIA+ health theme lead for the MD program at the University of Toronto. She's been active in migrant and health justice social movements while living in Toronto on lands that should be under the jurisdiction of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nations. Her interests include building anti-oppressive medical education and clinical practice, as well as harm reduction. So really great to have you, Dr. Rai. Our second panelist is Ms. Habon Ali, who recently graduated as valedictorian from the University of Toronto. She completed a double major in biology and environmental sciences and is working towards an MSc in global health at McMaster University. Currently, Habon is an intern at Mars Discovery District, where she's contributing to improving NEET, N-E-E-T, not in education, employment, or training, youth employment opportunities. As a member of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, Habon was actively involved in the creation of Canada's first national youth policy. She's passionate about removing systemic barriers for marginalized and vulnerable youth, community building, and health equity. So a huge welcome to Dr. Nanki Rai and Ms. Habon Ali. And I'd now like to turn it over to Gagan, who's going to lead us through the next panel. And again, if you have any questions during the panel, please do direct them to Gagan. You'll find his name in the chat. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Anita, and thank you so much again for Dr. Rai and Miss Ali for joining us tonight. We're very excited to learn from your experiences. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. So, one of the goals of this panel was to highlight how folks at different stages of their healthcare career are thinking about and approaching anti-oppression, reflecting on some of your journeys to now being a health professional and as a student in public health. Can you tell us about some of the work you are involved in and what led you or inspired you to work on anti-oppression research and initiatives? And to start, perhaps we can start with Dr. Rai.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm someone, as Anita already mentioned, I came to Canada as a migrant settler from India-occupied Kashmir at the age of 10. So, at that age, I didn't have the words, but I knew that and understood that the harm Kashmiris were facing and continue to experience was happening as a result of the militarized violence and occupation. And there was lots of subtle and not so subtle ways that colonialism and neocolonialism was impacting everyday movements of Kashmiris, our forests, our rivers, and the rest of the environment. So when I came to Canada at the age of 10, I quickly began to realize and learn how I now existed on the other side of that equation. So, of course, I didn't learn that through my formal education or through popular, like mainstream media, but I learned that because I ended up being in close relationships with a number of youth at my school who were Indigenous to Turtle Island. And it made me realize that while we had been experiencing exploitation and marginalization elsewhere, we were now the ones who were benefiting and gaining wealth and resources through, the ongoing expropriation and exploitation of Indigenous lands and people. So I appreciate us starting with that land acknowledgement, and I just wanted to start by acknowledging my work and how I've come to anti-oppressive practice has really is rooted in both my experiences as a migrant and as well as a settler. So fast forward, I think this might be the more interesting bit as opposed to going into details around work I'm doing currently. But in my late teens and early 20s, I was growing up in Guelph, Ontario. So if any of you know the stereotypes of Guelph, Ontario, some of them are true. And then I also moved to Toronto in my early 20s, and I started becoming more and more aware, and actually mainly started gaining the words to be able to speak to the ideological and the institutional and the interpersonal and the internalized ways that oppression was showing up in my life and in the life of people I cared about. And I think that's really what led me to grassroots activism, especially particularly migrant justice movements through my work with Known as Legal at that time, and also to street medic collectives, both in Guelph and in Toronto, because I knew that learning about oppression that we were facing wasn't enough, and not doing something about it was actually starting to harm my mental health. And part of, I knew that resisting oppression and trying to build a better world alongside others was also a commitment that I had to my own ancestors, including my grandparents who had been involved in political movements as well. So why I share all of this, for me, I think, I came to the framework of anti-oppression very much through grassroots organizing and being involved in social movements. So, anti-oppressive strategies, actions, the ways of relating to each other really came from that for me. And the two ways that I would summarize it for me is really, one, not all of us are facing the same ways that oppression is operating at that ideological, institutional, societal, interpersonal, internalized way. And so we need to actually commit to studying and learning from each other in terms of how systems are, disproportionately producing violence in some communities and not others. And I think it was trying to understand how different communities' privileges and oppressions were intersecting with each other and trying to get to the root of that violence where that's how I came to understanding anti-oppression. And a big part of that for me was what I would call prefigurative politics, right? Recognizing that in working to resist institutions and structural violence and the arbiters of oppression, we needed to do the work in a way that didn't actually, replicate and reinforce those very oppressive hierarchies within our own political organizing work and our own movements. And so I encourage folks to read about prefigurative politics, read about Paulo Freire, consider the ideas of the fact that the future is not predetermined. That's how I gain hope, right? I don't operate through this world thinking that the future has already been decided by those with power. I operate through the world knowing that it's our actions and the ways that we relate to each other and the ways that we build interdependency and collective care and resist from that space. We can build the future that we're all wanting for ourselves and our communities. So just leave it at that.
Thanks for sharing that generational lens, Dr. I really, really appreciate that. Ms. Ali, I will repeat the question. Would you like me to do that, or?
I'm good to answer, but if you'd like to,
Oh, if you're good to answer,
the audience
go
sake,
ahead.
then that's fine.
Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for sharing your personal experience and like your positionality in the work that you do. I think it's so important. And when I view anti-oppression, like the goals of anti-oppression are deeply tied to the survival and well-being of my community. So like I deeply resonate with that, and how you mentioned how we benefit as migrants, but also settlers on this land is a conversation my family and I are having, you know, as Muslims. What does that mean for our worship, and how can we actively engage in supporting our Indigenous brothers and sisters? So thank you for that. That resonated with me. So what inspired me to approach anti-oppression in all the work that I do, and specifically when it comes to healthcare, is a deeply personal reason. You know, seeing my loved ones, neighbors, and community members not being able to live out the full potential of their lives was the primary reason. And as with many other folks who are involved in this work for me as a visibly Muslim Black woman is linked to my survival. You know, advocacy, which I engage in informal structures, but also in informal grassroots way. And I don't consider myself an activist because I think that label holds a lot of weight, and the people that do that work deserve the respect and recognition, and their work deserves to be placed at the forefront. And I simply have not done anything to deserve that title, but sometimes it's placed on me. Advocacy isn't something that folks in our communities just pick up as a hobby. There really isn't a choice, right? So I found myself in the sciences due to my experiences growing up in a low-income racialized community with a large family. So my parents came to Canada in the early 90s. They fled civil war in Somalia. And I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters. I'm the middle child. And my youngest brother was born when I was 14, and he lives with a rare genetic disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome. So he spent the first few years of his life in and out of Sick Kids Hospital. I spent this time as a curious child with a binder of notes, you know, a 14-year-old bugging my grade 9 science teacher, like, what's happening? What's the cell cycle? Can you help me figure this out? And, you know, my goal was just to be, you know, play the role of a bigger sister and support my brother. And at that time, I thought I had all the solutions and answers and I could figure it out with just a little bit of learning. But that was a little bit of naive optimism I had as a child. But it's what sparked my interest in the sciences. But what really disheartened me throughout this whole experience was how my mother and father were treated throughout the healthcare system. Their presence was often met with a dismissive attitude. People were questioning their competence and really condescending remarks. So my dad's a taxi cab driver, and my mom was an early childhood professional, and she retired to meet the caregiving needs of my brother alongside other family members. But you know, they would do 12 hours on and off when my brother was in the hospital for long periods of time, sometimes months on end. And at this time, you know, when I went with my mom, I was often told to be the intermediary. Like, does she know what she's doing? Does she know what she's talking about? You know, some of it even led to a children's aid investigation that was really harmful at a time where my family was just coming to terms with learning how to care for my brother. So this really caused a lot of mental health stress for my family and I, and just seeing how they were navigating it, but also how they were being treated as Black people, as visibly Muslim people. It was disheartening, and it was my first experience at knowing that, you know, racialized and immigrant populations in our city, across this country, you know, differ in their levels of access to healthcare. I was born in Rexdale. It's a vibrant, lively, and diverse community in Toronto, but unfortunately, due to poverty and systemic racism, there are many challenges that youth and children in our communities face. Challenges rooted in poverty, such as and underemployment and gun violence. So it's typical to see GoFundMe circling. Most youth in my communities have Toronto Police Services on post notifications because of some of the violence that's happening in our communities, and it's normal to parade more funerals for young people than it is to have for the elderly. So the insidious ways that systemic racism manifests throughout our institutions was very clear to me in my upbringing, and it really pushed everything that I did, whether it was advising the prime minister for 2 years, which was quite the experience, you know. But I learned a lot about political will in that time, or whether it was the research that I wanted to conduct in undergrad. You know, I was literally grasping at the straws, trying to do anything I could to get justice for my community. So from the outside, it does look like a lot is happening and what I was involved with, but it was deeply tied to just knowing that your postal code or skin color could really determine your life outcomes and well-being in this country, and that didn't sit well with me. So it drove a lot of the work that I did, and it was never work I did alone. And I get emotional thinking about it now because community really shows up in beautiful ways, whether it's through research or community building or formal ways that we navigate. But just seeing how poverty limits the choices of a lot of people, and literally like strips us of like such meaningful connections with our loved ones is what drives me, and it fuels me to do this work. And it's why I think it's so important and should be central to everyone, but especially folks in the healthcare field. So yeah, that's a little bit about what drives me in this work.
It's so humbling to hear how, despite all that work, you don't call yourself an activist, right? So, but thanks for
I don't
sharing
deserve that title.
Yeah,
I really
no,
don't. If you really like reflect on it, you can't. You have to really earn that. And I think, yeah, no, thank you.
yeah, for sure. Thank you for like sharing your positionality as well, and like how that influenced kind of your trajectory in all this work too. Really, really appreciate that context. So for the second question, could you explain what anti-oppression work means to you? Can any research project or initiative that works on an issue of equity or involves a marginalized group or community be anti-oppressive? Or are there particular principles, ways of thinking, practices that shape how you make your work anti-oppressive? And are there ways that you're maybe engaging in anti-oppressive work in a way that is sustainable and non-harmful? And that could be for yourself or to others in whatever kind of context you want to interpret those. Dr. Rai, do you want to take this one to alternate and give Miss Ali a little break?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that for most folks who are showing up here, recognizing that, yeah, I think when we start labeling any research project or initiative that somehow, includes quote unquote marginalized communities as being inherently anti-oppressive is harmful, right? Like that's dangerous because we are not getting at the root. For me, anti-oppression, it's a framework, it's a set of principles that really originate out of like Black feminist, particularly Black queer feminist thought, as well as activism and resistance. And so when the goal of anti-oppressive work for me is about understanding how the structures of, settler colonialism at a global stage, and imperialism, and I would say settler colonialism in Canada is a form of imperialism. The Canadian state is an imperialist state against the Indigenous nations of whose lands that they're continuing to expropriate. And so when we think about the frameworks of imperialism, colonialism, and racial capitalism, and how they've created hierarchies for social control through, supremacist ideologies of racism and classism and casteism and ableism, cis heteropatriarchy, that to me is getting at the root of anti-oppression. So if the work that we're doing is not engaging with that broader framework, then we're not doing anti-oppression work. What we're doing is we're co-opting language of people who've been fighting for their survival, as Hapan just said, that, yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And in terms of sustainability, there's a few questions that I often ask myself, because sustainability and not doing more harm is incredibly important in this work. And so I think for me, I ask myself, how are hierarchies existing? We know that disposability and commodification are really antithesis, and exploitation are antithesis to anti-oppression. So how are we actually resisting that in our work? How are we creating and dismantling hierarchies? How are we building accountable leadership? How are we doing skill sharing? And particularly, how are we creating horizontal structures where decision making is done through the collective, where labor and how we labor is collectively decided and shared equitably. And I think that's hugely important. I think other things around sustainability that I think about is professionalism. You know, the very fact that all of us are existing within professionalized system, how are these institutions using us to co-opt language and practices coming out of communities of struggle? And how are you resisting that in the work that you do? And I know the title of our discussion today is Engaging Communities, but how are you showing up for communities and asking communities for leadership and accountability? And I think what goes hand in hand with that for me is how does saviorism and charity model and paternalism show up in this work and show up through you? Because again, anti-oppression requires solidarity. It doesn't require charity. And so how are you interacting with that? How are you engaging with that within yourself and with other people that you're working with? And in terms of harm, I mean, yeah, there's a lot we could say about harm. Maybe I'll leave it at that for now and let you answer first, Siobhan.
No, thank you so much for that. And I echo everything that you said. Like, wow, if we could just like print that and keep it somewhere, I think that's so important. So I won't touch on what you said, but I just did want to circle back to like, in talking about my communities, there's a lot of pain and loss, but we're so much more than our social barriers. Like even with language, like I think we'll get into that a bit later, and how we speak about our communities, I think is really important. And I personally believe that not every project or initiative that works on the issue of equity or involves marginalized groups is anti-oppressive. There are people who have co-opted the language, like Dr. Rhea said, and have created really tokenistic, performative, superficial initiatives and projects. And not saying that knowing the language is the end all be all, because not everyone has the access to learning that lets us locate this language. But I'm still even learning the language. But when I learn about theories and I read and I learn alongside other people, I'm able to name my experiences in that. And that's something that's really special and powerful as well, because you recognize it right away. In terms of like principles or practices that help shape my work, I'm Muslim, and I say that proudly in every room and space I enter, because Islamophobia is on the rise. And unfortunately, last September, at my local mosque, one of our elders was murdered by a white supremacist. So these things are close to home, and that happened in Rexdale. I'm not sure if folks know, like when I often tell people, they're shocked, like that happened here. It did happen here. Actually, white supremacy is the biggest domestic threat to Canada's national security, but unfortunately it's not something that we talk about. And if I probably had said this maybe 2 years ago, I might have got kicked out of this call, but like it's discussions we need to start having, right? And for me as a Muslim, there's a divine duty in my faith tradition and an emphasis on justice that's guided by the Quran and our Prophet. And there's a standard I must hold, and I'm going to be held accountable for my actions, and people have rights upon me. So there's collective rights, and that's what we believe as Muslims. So it's a great joy for me to be able to actualize worship through care for others. And that really centers a lot of my work. It's how I was raised. As another practice that I try to maintain is that I never do anything alone. My work is always in collaboration with those already doing the work. If you think you're the first to do something, you're probably not. And it can create a lot of harm to try to recreate the wheel. So try to work with others. And when we're talking about harm, there's often like the double-edged sort of research. I try not to contribute to research without acting on it in my community. So like, for example, currently, in my master's program, I'm researching the experiences of Somali Canadian youth in Rexdale, so my community, and how COVID-19 has impacted their health and well-being. And I'm taking a qualitative approach to sort of illustrate the human experience behind statistics, because sometimes the human experience can get drowned out. But I feel really guilty about doing this work because it feels like you're exploiting the community, but those with power will not act until they have this data that they so badly want. And oftentimes, even when they have it, they don't act. So it's like this cycle of frustration. So I try my best to be engaging in work that is supporting youth. So even my part-time job right now is helping youth have access to opportunities to employment. Youth who are often furthest from opportunity. And like I said, just seeing my loved ones not being able to live out the full potentials of their lives is what draws a lot of my work. And I try to like often reflect on my positionality and where I'm located, and try to understand social structures and powers and the harm I'm contributing to. But also, it's hard being a Black grad student. It's hard being in this research space, and it's hard doing this work. So I try to carve out a lot of time for self-care, and I work with a lot of incredible Black Muslim women who really like check me, because you need people who will be able to tell you, if you're on the right track, but also will support you and call you in and share love with you and self-care. So you really need to take care of yourself before you can do this work, or else you will be burnt out. But you don't have to do this work alone, and it isn't scary once you realize that you don't have to do it alone, because people are kind. Most people are, and you can do it together. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Oh,
I'll-
sorry.
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
was just going to add, one of the things that I was just thinking about as you were talking is, harm is not something that we can get away from, right? We have to recognize that harm is going to happen through this work. And so a lot of what I'm also thinking about and trying to think about, how do you, I think about transformative justice in the context of grassroots organizing, because that's where I've been able to practice it and see it play out. And I'm trying to think about, how do we actually bring the principles in of transformative justice work in order for us to engage with conflict and do conflict well, and deal with harm in a way that doesn't just replicate the carceral system, right? When harm happens, our gut reaction is going to punishment and to inflict further harm and isolation. We need to get that person away from us, or we need to get them fired, or we need to do whatever. Not to say that those are not valid things that need to happen at some point, if depending on what harm has happened, because that might be the accountable thing to do. But how do we build better accountability without seeing people as being disposable? So that's one of the things that I think about when it comes to harm and mitigating harm. And then I'm also thinking about burnout and care. And constantly, I think, these systems that are built on colonial violence and on the violence of racial capitalism that all of us are inherently working within, we're constantly experiencing betrayals, we're constantly experiencing harm, and constantly experiencing disrespect in these spaces. And I think that's what leads to burnout, right? It's not how much yoga we all got to do last month. And so I think that's the question that I asked myself around, how are we building interdependency? How are we doing collective care in order to actually be able to become more expansive in all of our capacities to resist and constantly have to fight against these institutions? And I think striving for perfectionism, a lot of us have gotten here because we've mastered the skill of being obedient and perfectionist one way or another. And we have to engage with that within ourselves, because anti-oppressive work is messy and it's hard. We cannot expect perfectionism. It actually gets in the way. And so how is that showing up for you? And then the other thing is, often people, will talk about how they feel guilty, and maybe that's why they're coming. But guilt is often a pretty immobilizing and a really self-consuming emotion. So how are we showing up? Because we're wanting to embrace discomfort, and we're wanting to be committed to each other's joy and laughter with each other in this work, because I think that's incredibly, incredibly important in also undoing harm. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for sharing that, like both your responses. Like really what I heard was a lot of solidarity, collaboration, working together when it comes to this work, whether it's for sustainability or if it's for the nature of the initiatives or projects themselves, and even the motivations underpinning anti-O work, and really interrogating ourselves and in a compassionate way, but in a way that focuses on self-improvement and of those around us too. So thank you for sharing that. For the last question, then I suppose, for the learners here or people looking to engage in anti-oppressive research or work in the future, what would you recommend to those who don't know where to start? Are there any barriers you faced when engaging with anti-O work that may be faced by future researchers? And how did you, or are you, overcoming these barriers? And we'll go ahead and start with Miss Ali this time, since if that's
Yeah,
okay with you.
Yeah, no, I will definitely get into some of the barriers I face, because there's a lot, and it's scary to come across these barriers, especially with that perfectionism, but the professionalism, and like the being in nonpartisan spaces, and how that further harms people of color, but also like it just, I have a lot to say on that, but it's okay not to know what it's not okay to stay ignorant though, when you know that there's some learning to do. And we're all at different stages of our learning journeys, but that learning should never happen at the expense of BIPOC lives, of women, of gender diverse people, of communities who are pushed to the margins. No, like that should not be happening. We need to prioritize education and awareness, and that responsibility should not fall on the people who are experiencing the oppression. Um, Black students, wow, we sometimes carry institutions on our back. You know, it's an work that we do, and we're really pushed out of a lot of professional spaces of opportunity because we speak out, and it takes a lot of courage to speak out. So I say, if you see your classmates, you know, taking a courageous stand, doing something, know that there was probably 10 million conversations that happened behind the scenes. They did the cost benefit analysis, they cried, they did everything that they could, probably not to get to that point, but now they have to be vocal. So really support them and know that it takes a lot of courage, and it isn't someone being annoying or bringing up race for the 50th time in your program or your class. If someone's doing that, there's a real problem. It takes a lot to get to that point, and before someone is silenced, you have to do something. Just know that if you stay silent, you're complicit in that harm that is being created. So please support your fellow students. There's power in numbers, and that can't be understated. Like, you can't all get in trouble, you know, and they're more likely to listen when there's more people involved. So please support your fellow students. For me, a lot of barriers have been learning to navigate these spaces without like a blueprint, entering political spaces that I wasn't meant to be in, entering, you know, postgraduate education, navigating it as a first-gen student, you know, growing up in poverty. Like, there's so many barriers that exist. Racism is definitely a difficult one. Islamophobia is really hard to navigate because it's one that people don't check as well. It's just like, it's one that is often allowed to go unchecked. So I would say for learners, like, please just take that education, but also know when to act. I think people stop at the listening and learning bit, like, oh, I'm listening and learning, I don't have to do X, Y, Z, but your action matters. And even if it's messy and imperfect, you know, we do know that you're trying, and that acts of solidarity, they matter the most to me. Something else I'm doing right now, there's actually a group of physicians who created a group called Stand Up for Health. They're grassroots, nonpartisan, non-for-profit organization, young health professionals, and they're actually creating a learning module and experience, and I've been helping them to work through some of the modules they're creating on anti-Black racism. And we've been running a lot of focus groups with maybe obviously paying people for their time and really walking the walk with that. But we've been speaking to a lot of medical students and residents. And I have an interest in medicine, but after speaking to them, you know, and learning about their experiences, it's a little disheartening to know what folks go through. So for all of the Black students here today, you know, my heart is with you. You're doing good work. We need you. Our communities need you. Please keep going. But also to know that, like, your classmates are going through a totally different experiences, the emotional labor and management that goes with like navigating these spaces and facing oppression. And then you have to actually be a student too. Like, that is exhausting. So please stand with people. Don't lose that empathy or compassion, and force yourself to be with communities and learn that way too. I think obviously don't insert yourself in spaces that people create, like safe spaces for themselves, but actually being with people and learning about their experiences firsthand is the best knowledge that and the best way of learning, at least for myself too. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, my goodness, there's so much there. Definitely echoing all of that. And I think, you know, I think I was alluding to this already, but I will just say that a lot of our formal and the hidden curriculum, as we like to call it, really forces us, and these institutions, these structures have tried to force us to be subjects, right? To be people who conform and people who obey. And I think, you know, being anti-authoritarian and thinking and speaking for ourselves can feel very scary and destabilizing, particularly if that's something you haven't had to do because of having enough privilege to be able to survive up until this point. So I think, thinking about that, and for me, engaging in community and building people power. And when I talk about community, I mean, talk about peers, people within your field and outside of your field who share your values, so you can go to them for pulse checks and for accountability, but also to communities that face the brunt of structural violence. How do you build long-term sustainable relationships with people, both as an ethical and a strategic recognition, right? Solidarity isn't just this like floofy idea that we all want to strive for. Solidarity is actually necessary for all of us to actually achieve liberation. And like Kaban said, like it is how we actually defeat these large structures who retain a whole lot of power. And so asking yourself, what does that look like? How do you show up for communities rather than how do communities show up for you? And I'll just say, in terms of where to start and what's been helpful for me throughout both working in medical education and in medical practice, how I relate to people, how I relate to my colleagues, how I relate to my clients is rooted in the values of Anti-O. And that's been helpful. And then the decisions I make, the things that I choose to do and don't do, are very much based in, this idea that abolitionists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore have taught, and many others have taught, around building non-reformist reforms. And so for me, what that means is, versus reformist reforms, non-reformist reforms are changes that actually destabilize the institutions, that actually take power and resources away from the institution and towards communities that are actually working to dismantle those institutions. And how do we do that in the decisions that I'm making? And am I engaging with work that actually is just rebuilding the power and the scope and the level of control that these institutions have by engaging in reformist reforms? And while engaging in non-reformist reforms and making sure that I'm guiding my decisions from that place, I'm also asking myself, how are we building, the social relationships and the institutions that actually truly focus on decolonization, that actually truly focus on centering Indigenous sovereignty and centering self-determination and collective liberation at the core of this work. And as a way, in terms of like where to start, I think we can't dismantle something we don't understand, and we can't build something anew if we don't actually commit to studying and struggle. And so I encourage you to read work done by so many people in the world. And like two books that came to mind, or two people that came to mind, is obviously Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. If you haven't read that, please read it. Particularly for those of you who are learners and going through these institutions. And then also, I was thinking a lot about, particularly for the researchers and research and public health students here, I was thinking about Walter Rodney's work around guerrilla intellectuals. And so I encourage you to read more about that and what it would require for you to actually, again, the question is the work that you're doing legitimizing power, or is it exposing it and therefore destabilizing the hegemony that these institutions have? I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Again, like really like taking that next step is what I kind of heard. And part of that is listening to others, but also taking the initiative upon yourself to kind of educate yourself and make sure the actions that you kind of are planning are aligned with the goals of these different communities. So thank you for that. One extra plug would, if you're looking for literature, might even be Dr. Rai's Uprooting Medical Violence, Building an Integrated Anti-Oppression Framework for Primary Healthcare text, which you can just kind of Google. Dr. Rai, medical violence. Yeah, so I have one question from the audience that I really want to ask. So this question relates to social movements as they relate to geographic positionality. So do you know of any specific or broader radical political organizations, to get involved with? And so this could be based on wherever you've kind of different areas that you've lived in, or just generally within Canada, if you have that broader socio-political kind of background.
Yeah, my response to that would be like, ask yourself where you're located in this work, and where you particularly experience oppression, and where you hold privilege. And then I think move and connect with the communities that you belong to, because I think we can't engage in solidarity work if we aren't also struggling for our own liberation. So, this idea of the savior and I'm just working on my privilege, it doesn't work. You have to actually do this work grounded in your own understanding and your own location. So I'll start with that. But of course, there's just so much. There's so many. Literally Google social movements or grassroots collectives, or create one. I'm thinking about the Black Public Health Collective that's. I think they're based out of Toronto, maybe, or graduate students from the Delaware School of Public Health, but also work with people all across the country. I think about organizations like Abolition Now, BLM, defundingthepolice.org is a coalition of groups right now that are doing this work. No One Is Legal is continuing to do their work, with CCF, from, Justice for Migrant Workers, in terms of folks who are working with migrant workers in Southern Ontario. Doctors Running Police, there's so many different spaces, and there's never a shortage of building collective spaces, because in that you're also learning skills, you're learning how to chair meetings together, you're learning how to actually listen to one another and come to consensus, as opposed to just the majority wins, right? Because the majority winning is not how anti-oppression works. Anti-oppression is achieved if those who are most pushed to the margins are actually centered in the work and are liberated. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that question.
You've named like every single one that came to mind, so there's that. But also just encouraging folks to, like Dr. Ray said, to think about where you fit in that puzzle. And like, for example, a lot of those organizations have supported some of the informal work a lot of youth in my community, so the Somali Canadian community, have been doing. So there was a sexual violence crisis that we had as a community last summer, and a couple of friends and I from Alberta and Ontario got together and created a resource that was circulated by a lot of these movements, and they supported us. And just knowing that the gaps that existed into accessing just care and support, whether it's mental or physical health, that exists. So like, there's always room for collaboration. It doesn't have to be formal. People will show up for you. So if you notice a gap, or you notice something that's wrong, or you have a skill set that is particularly useful, we could research for days straight. So we said we can create a tool for, let's do this. And it was so well received by our community, and it was used by so many people who still message us today. So whatever skill you have, and even like the arts and creatives, like, you guys are so powerful. You folks are so powerful. Like, I wish I was creative in that way. I'm not, but like, everybody is needed in these spaces. So yeah, just bring your talents, and as long as you're mindful, I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, like, organize with your mosque, like organize with your community center, organize with people who show up at your baseball team, like organize wherever you can. I think direct democracy at the end of the day is what we're asking for, and what all of us want, right? We all want to participate in building the future together. And so do that work in the ways that actually bring you joy, and in the ways that you're connected to people in your life, instead of trying to create entirely new structures. And while you're within these institutions, I always ask myself again, like, how can I divert power and resources away from these institutions and towards my communities and other communities? And sometimes that looks like using the printer you have access to print out the flyers for the rally. Or it means, you got a huge grant and you're going to decide to actually hand over decision-making power and resource allocation power and work from the very top to who the interviewees are in your research project, and do that work collaboratively. So, this work can look redistributing power and resources towards community can look in lots of big and small ways. And I think that's part of the question to ask ourselves when we're doing this as well.
Yeah, it really sounds like there's no dearth of need for these opportunities. We just really sort of need to open up abilities to kind of execute them. Kind of harkens back to everything is political, right?
Yeah, and that the personal is political, right? I don't think I would have survived these institutions if I wasn't collectively organizing with other students. And that includes both my public health education as well as medical school. In public health, I was organizing with other students. In medical school, I was organizing with communities that I belong to. So depending on where you are and what makes sense for you and what brings you the most joy, collective organizing is also what's necessary for that immediate survival as well.
For sure.
100%. Yeah, health is political. It really is. And I think I hear a lot from students who like push back on that, like there's still that dominant narrative that it isn't, and honestly challenge that, because access to resources, political will determines so much of like the non-clinical aspects of people in my community, my families, my loved ones, that impact our health, impact our lifespan, and impact like just our whole life trajectory. So yeah, health is definitely political. Yeah.
Sure. I think we have time for one more question. And so this question really asks, what resources do you use when engaging in anti-oppressive research? And what can students or people in general, more broadly, learn more about doing this work accountably? It's a bit of a a more critical question, so take your time.
Yeah, I mean, it means like actually doing the work, right? There's no like recipe that I could possibly share around this, but um, I think it's important to show up in this work with humility and recognize that there is so much that we're not going to know ourselves, and that we need to learn from people whose labor is being exploited and who are not giving credit. And asking ourselves who those people are around us in our institutions. And that might be a place to go and actually showing up and saying, how can I support you? And what is the learning that I need to do to be able to support those around me? Accountability to me is, we often talk about reflexivity in these institutions. Like we need to practice, especially as clinicians, like we need to practice reflexivity. And whenever that gets brought up in the ways that at least it was when I was in medical school, oftentimes it was talked about as something you have to do on your own. And for me, like we are social beings, we have to build with each other. And so oftentimes I ask myself, I have a network of people and a group of people that I go to on a regular basis where I'm checking in with them and I'm saying, listen, I think this is, this way that I behaved, or this thing that I said, or this thing that I didn't say, I feel like actually contributed to that person feeling more dehumanized or feeling stigmatized or feeling othered. And we have to ask ourselves that. What are the things that we did in a day, at the end of the day, after working in that hospital or in that clinic or in that public health unit or in that research team? How did we treat somebody else in a way that may have made them feel dehumanized, othered, or silenced? And you can't ask that question to yourself. You have to ask that question to others around you who you trust, and who will be honest with you, because they're invested in your own growth as well. So I think that's incredibly important for accountability. And what was the other question? Like resources?
Yeah, resources and accountability. Yeah, so
Yeah.
what resources would you use? Yeah, or do you use?
I mean, like, if I could show you my desk right now, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Maybe those books behind
9
you
books
too?
right now. Yeah, like read with others, like the same thing, right? Like don't read by yourself, because I never get enough out of something unless when I've read and I've actually talked to somebody else about it. And I remember when I was first engaging in this work and engaging in grassroots organizing, like political education is a key part of this work. And it's not elitist to think about that, right? And we all have to commit to doing that. So pick a book, do reading clubs. Like I wish we did more of them. And that's how I grew. When I got to talk about something that I read that twisted my brain, I can't make sense of it. Let me talk to other people. How did you take that? And so some of the books that I've been like rereading or reading, especially since I started in my role at U of T, is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like I already said. Most recently, so I'm sure everyone has heard me say this 1,000 times now, but Dean Spade, who's a longtime trans activist and organizer in the US, put out a book called Mutual Aid, which is a book I wish I had in my hands when I was 16. And it's a book, so it's called Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. And so I encourage you to read that. I recently reread Robin Maynard's book, and this is like excellent. And also just trying to understand how do you talk about this work, and how do you teach, and how do you build education that's actually truly intersectional. And the other thing that I often take away from rereading this book is, how do we talk about this work without not just focusing on the suffering, but also being really mindful of putting the lens on the arbiters of violence and the structures of violence, but also amplifying the work of resistance that has always been here. As long as structural violence has existed, communities have always resisted it and have always found ways to take care of their own communities and each other. and have actually pushed and shaped broader policy that's improved the lives of many others outside of their community. So read about that. There's a book on the young lords that I definitely recommend that people read. Maybe I can pull it out from my, it's called The Young Lords Reader. Read Body and Soul, book on the Black Panthers and their survival programs. So many books. I'm rereading Black Marxism, which is by Robinson, and it is twisting my brain in ways that it needs to be twisted. So I would recommend reading that book alongside other people and maybe reading like 5 pages at a time and talking about it. Yeah. Yeah, it's not even my fave books. It's literally just the books that are around. Bell Hooks, Feminist Theory, From Center to Margin. Yeah, we got to put in the work.
I love
What that essentially said is I need to read more, and that dragged me. No, I definitely do need to read more. I'll leave the book recommendations to you. Yeah, it's hard to find the time to carve out to read, but it is important. And I echo the one on policing Black lives. I think that book has really I was like angry reading it. I was sad reading it, but even reflecting on it, I think I was in a book club at the time when we started to read it. Kind of fell apart because people were busy. But it was. Oh, I keep getting a FaceTime. Sorry, but that was really like that book. It was so important for me to read, especially after everything that happened this past year. Definitely agree with that. I think I learned most from people, and I think there's an incredible organizer called Rania Al-Mugammer. She's based in Toronto. I think her Instagram is like Rania Writes, or Twitter as well. And I really love her work. And something that she said really sticks with me. And it's that like, you know, we've been learning transformative justice through our mothers, through our grandmothers, our whole life, right? Like the work that they do, it doesn't have a label, it doesn't have a name. They probably can't name the theories or whatever, but they're doing that work and they're putting in the work. And I think just seeing people in my life and in my community doing the work has really been that example for me, but that definitely doesn't excuse reading. And I definitely have to do more of that. But I've been really blessed and lucky to learn from incredible people in my life. And that's where I do a lot of my learning. Yeah.
Yeah, completely. Exactly. I think for me, like if we were just reading these books on our own, there wouldn't be anything. And I don't think I'd be doing any of this if it wasn't for my grandparents and my parents and aunties and uncles actually talking about these things when I was a little one running around and then just absorbing the language and the experiences that they were sharing with each other. So I 100% agree. There's so much wisdom and knowledge within our own communities that we need to uplift and learn from. And especially within the academy, right? We forget that. So I appreciate that reminder.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you both for kind of like sharing like your experiences so openly as they relate to like, you know, your background, your positionality, but then also how you've and your approaches to how you're engaging with communities and creating sustainable change in a way that is also healthy for you too, while we're kind of trying to improve the turmoil that is around us, the never-ending work, right? Thanks for joining us in Block A. So the title of this block is Examining Inequities in Healthcare Services and Research. And so in this block, we will have 2 presentations, one by Navitha Chandran and one by jointly presented by doctors Fatima Kadada and Christine Matuziak. And so just to introduce our first presenter, Navitha Chandran is a second-year Master's of Science student in the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto, and who is passionate and interested about health equity and the interplay of the social determinants of health on our well-being. And she hopes to help bridge the gap between underserved populations and access to healthcare, especially rehabilitation services. And our second set of presenters, Dr. Fatima Kadada is a PGY6 fellow in clinical hematology who is undergoing further training in leukemia and aspires to one day pursue a career in education with a focus on health equity. Dr. Christine Matuziak is a PGY 6 fellow as well, undertaking specialty training in red blood cell disorders at the University Health Network. She is interested in education and red blood cell disorders and is hoping to pursue further research at the intersection of both. So without further ado, take it away, Navita.
Thank you so much. Alrighty, so good evening, everyone. Can everyone see my screen? Just want to do a double check.
I think we can also see your presenter notes. If that's okay with you, you can progress as you intend. Maybe if there's a way to increase the size of the actual screen.
Okay.
Of the slide, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Let me reshare my screen.
No worries.
There you go. Is that better?
Perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Navita Chandran, and today I'd like to present my master's thesis that I'm currently working on. And it's examining whether the social terms of health predict engagement exercise in people living with HIV, in which I've been working closely with Dr. Sergio Rueda, Dr. Andrew Pinto, and Dr. Kelly O'Brien. So as of 2016, the prevalence of people living with HIV was 63,110 in Canada. And the number of people living with HIV in Canada has been growing since the 1980s. Although many may think this is due to the increase in incidence, it's actually due to the increase in effective treatment as well. So in fact, in Canada, HIV is considered a chronic condition due to many people living with HIV having access to antiretroviral therapy and being able to be diagnosed earlier. So they're able to suppress their viral loads and live longer and healthier lives. In fact, in North America, around half the people living with HIV are 50 years of age or above. So in general, as people age, they're more likely to face health complications such as chronic conditions, including diabetes, geriatric syndromes, such as cognitive impairment. However, people living with HIV are more likely to face greater complications like HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders, chronic inflammation, and lung disease. Furthermore, due to the stigma and other social health-related factors, their mental health, social capital, and other factors are severely impacted. And therefore, the combination of physical, mental, and social health-related consequences of HIV can be defined as disability. So physical activity and exercise has been used and is being used as a rehabilitation intervention to mitigate the disability experienced by people living with HIV. And according to the World Health Organization, 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity and with at least 2 days of resistance activities per week is recommended for adults and older adults to live a balanced and healthy life. Although there are a lot of documented benefits of engaging exercise, few people are regularly engaging, and that had led to the implementation of community-based exercise programs, CBE for short, and people living with HIV who took part in those community-based exercise programs reported better social, physical, and mental health after participation. So the social terms of health are defined as conditions that people are born, grow, live, and age and work. And this shapes our level of power, income, and other determinants of life and plays a crucial role in the creation of health inequities. And these are avoidable differences in our health status. While some studies have illustrated a link between income, social support, education level, and engagement exercise in the general population and people living with chronic conditions such as HIV, we still don't have a fulsome understanding of how the social determinants of health influence engagement exercise among people living with HIV. And there are also gaps regarding the role of certain social determinants of health, such as gender, employment status, and race. Therefore, this study is an attempt to fill those gaps in knowledge regarding the influence of social determinants of health, specifically for people living with HIV engaging in exercise. So the purpose of this study is to understand the influence of the social determinants of health on engagement exercise among community-dwelling adults living with HIV in Toronto. Specifically, we have two objectives, which are to describe the nature and extent of engagement exercise, and to examine whether the social determinants of health predict engagement exercise among these adults enrolled in a 25-week community-based exercise intervention. Specifically for objective 2, we are hypothesizing that participants who are Caucasian with a higher level of education, social support, and income will be more likely to engage in exercise during the intervention due to the role the social determinants of health play. So this is a longitudinal observational study using secondary data to examine the nature and extent of engagement. And participants of the study are those who initiated the intervention phase of a larger community-based exercise program led by Dr. O'Brien and team. So specifically for the community-based exercise program, participants were recruited using community organizations such as Casey House, the YMCA, and Realize. And in terms of eligibility, they had to be ages 18 and above, living in Toronto, and had to be able to participate in exercise. And we administered this using a self-administered physical activity readiness questionnaire. And specifically for my secondary analysis study that I'm speaking about today, they have to have completed the first phase of the study, which is a baseline monitoring phase, and then have reached the second phase of the intervention study. So in terms of the intervention, participants were asked to engage in 90 minutes of exercise 3 times a week, where one session would be with a coaching instructor at the YMCA for a total of 25 weeks. However, for some sessions and some participants, their sessions were rescheduled beyond 25 weeks up to 40 weeks. And this included various reasons such as disability, injury, and work. So here's just a quick overview of the data collection across the study. As you can see, the purple arrows point to the data sources that will describe the nature and extent of exercise, and the orange arrows and boxes point to the data sources that examine the social determinants of health predicting engagement exercise, who took part in the intervention phase of the study. So to describe the nature and extent of engagement exercise, the data will come from coaching logs administered by the YMCA coaches, self-reported exercise logs from the participants, and their YMCA attendance for using their membership card swipes. For the second objective, which are the predictive variables of engagement exercise, we largely gathered the data from demographic questionnaires that were administered at the baseline, start, and end of intervention. And I would also like to mention that we are utilizing the Public Health Agency of Canada's social determinants of health framework for this study. So in regard to data analysis, the nature and extent and the social determinants of health predictive variables were first described descriptively analyzed using frequency and percent for nominal ordinal variables, and then mean, standard deviation, and median, and 25th percentile and 75th percentile for continuous variables. In regards to the social determinants of health, predictive variables will undergo univariate analysis using chi-square and t-tests. And after the univariate analysis, predictive variables with significant results will be included in the logistic regression model built to predict if certain determinants of health predict engagement in exercise, and the outcome defined by the outcome variable. And for this study, our outcome variable is attending at least 72% of the coaching sessions, which is 18 out of the 25 sessions that was according to our protocol. So here are just some preliminary results in terms of the participants who initiated versus those who completed the study. As you can see, there are some similarities and differences between those who initiated and completed. And our goal is to understand which of these determinants are playing a significant role in the engagement and completion of the study, and why certain people weren't able to make it to the completion. So finally, in regards to implications of the study, we're hoping that this gives us a better understanding of engagement levels in exercise among people living with HIV in urban settings, and to understand the role of the social determinants of health in predicting engagement exercise. We also hope this study really sparks a discussion and consideration of the interplay of social determinants of health for people living with HIV and other chronic conditions. And for results of this to be used in future studies, and to spark discussions around creation of programs that are more equitable and take these determinants into consideration. Finally, there are just some limitations I'd like to mention. The sample size of the study is only 80 participants, and the number of participants who identified as female to male was small. So those are some limitations and challenges with this study. However, I do want to mention that the study overall hopes to demonstrate the upstream factors affecting engagement exercise among adults with HIV, and that this is an important start to a very important discussion we're going to have hopefully in the near future. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Gaga.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Avita. We'll take all the questions for both presentations at the end of the block. So if doctors Fatima Kadada and Christine Matuziak would like to begin presenting theirs, we're happy to go ahead.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Fatima, and I'll be presenting today. Christine is in attendance, and she'll be available for the Q&A at the end. So thank you very much for the introduction. So our study proposal is for a needs assessment of general internal medicine residents caring for sickle cell patients admitted with vaso-occlusive episodes. And I'll get right into it. So the scope of the issue is that there are more than 5,000 cases of sickle cell disease in Canada, and this number is rising because of improved survival and because of immigration. Pain crises are responsible for 90% of acute healthcare visits for patients with sickle cell disease. These admissions are often repetitive, they're often prolonged. And we know that from the literature, education in the realms of sickle cell disease and pain management are frankly very much lacking and have actually been described as an educational void. This is all compounded by the presence of anti-Black racism, which again, we know contributes to poor treatment in healthcare settings, for example, delayed access to pain medications. And I wanted to share this very remarkable image that Dr. Dale Doughton, who has an interest in medical history, has kindly shared with me. So the photo that you're looking at there is a photo of the tombstone of Walter Clement Knoll, who was the very first recorded case of sickle cell disease back in 1910. And Walter was a dental student who had moved from Grenada to Chicago to study dentistry. He came from a very rich, very educated background. And it's very interesting when you read the case report. Walter is described as a Black man who is intelligent, articulate, professional by the physicians who treated him and subsequently diagnosed him. And so one has to wonder whether the racial lens through which they had seen this patient and patients of sickle cell disease prior to that had affected how they had diagnosed him and whether this condition would have been diagnosed sooner if not for this. And so I think as an educational and clinical practitioner, we really need to pause and reflect on our current understandings of sickle cell disease before we propagate them on to learners. So we had two research questions. The first being, what are the training experiences of internal medicine residents when treating patients with sickle cell disease suffering from painful vaso-occlusive episodes? And the second being, what are the gaps, if any, in knowledge, skills, attitudes of residents when caring for sickle cell patients with pain crises? Because little is known about this in the internal medicine part of the problem, we hope to use a qualitative inductive approach relying on one-on-one semi-structured interviews with internal medicine residents who have cared for sickle cell patients. We plan on having an interview guide with prompts on issues such as pain, on sickle cell disease broadly, as well as implicit bias and its effects on care of sickle cell patients. For the time being, we plan to limit our interviews to internal medicine residents, but do hope to expand to other physicians in the care team, nurses, social workers, and of course, patients themselves in the future. So in terms of our data analyses, the interviews will be audio tape recorded and transcribed. The analysis will happen at the same time as data gathering, which will inform adjustments to the interview script, as well as interviewers' attentions with respect to their field notes. And this concurrent analysis will allow us to look for theoretical saturation. There are a few important limitations. The first, which I mentioned earlier, is that this does not capture the experiences of patients nor other members of the care team beyond internal medicine residents. And I think for the time being, for the sake of parsimony, we have limited it to internal medicine residents, but it will be incredibly important to expand subsequent to that. We also acknowledge that we as a research team differ in our cultural and racial backgrounds from the patients, but not necessarily the participants. And this is something that we will have to keep in mind when we come to our analyses. In terms of anticipated outcomes, we hope, one, to collect data from internal medicine residents on the educational practices and perceived gaps in training towards managing patients of sickle cell disease. Two, to develop recommendations to change and enhance internal medicine training curricula in pain management during hospitalizations for vaso-occlusive episodes. And finally, three, to help develop teaching moments around healthcare disparities and societal inequity delivery of care to individuals with sickle cell disease. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I leave you with this quote from The Bluest Eye, which I think is incredibly moving and incredibly pertinent to this particular problem.
Again, thank you for the amazing presentation and the quote at the end. I'll let Kajani lead the session. So take it away, Kajani.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations, Niveta and Dr. Kadara and Dr. Matusiak. I have a few questions. This one is for Niveta. How were participants recruited to the study? Which social determinant of health seemed to be most predictive of engagement with community program? And how can that be addressed in future initiatives?
Sounds good. So the participants are actually recruited for a larger community-based exercise study, and I'm doing just the intervention phase for my master's thesis that I'm focusing on. But pretty much they were recruited using community-based organizations such as Realize, Casey House, and participants of previous studies as well from our lab. And in regards to the determinants of health, it's still a work in progress in terms of my project, so I can't exactly tell you which ones have, in terms of my results, which ones have been the most predictors in terms of determinants. But if I were to give you an answer based off literature, it seems like gender plays a significant role based off of gender roles, for example, and just safety reasons and everything that we have to consider when working with people who identify as male, female, or non-binary, for example. And also, I believe income plays a crucial role because you're able to access exercise centers, for example, such as the YMCA. It does cost money for membership. And in terms of other determinants, we can look at education level, because that really correlates well with employment and income as well. So I think those are very key important ones you have to consider. And specifically race as well, I'm thinking would play a role in my results, but again, this is very preliminary, so I can't really comment on my own results, but this is based off literature in terms of determinants that have played a role.
Thank you for that, Niveta. This question is for Dr. Kadafa and Matusiak. What impact do you expect your findings to have in terms of your work?
Well, I can take this. I'll thank Fatima for speaking for us during her presentation. So we initially were thinking about diving right in and doing less of a qualitative study, to be honest. And once we really looked at the literature and what was out there, we realized that we really needed to go back to the beginning and start with qualitative inductive methods, because we think in order to generate an educational program, which is ultimately a goal, we need to understand the problem much more deeply. So ultimately, we would like to generate some kind of formal curriculum, especially given our experiences working as hematology fellows in Toronto, being able to offer that at UHN firstly, and expanding out to other hospitals that treat patients with sickle cell.
Thank you, Dr. Matusiak. This question is for Nivetha. Sometimes physical fitness is difficult to determine. The idea of the BMI has been critiqued. How did you consider anti-oppression when crafting a definition of level of fitness?
Thank you for that question. That's a really good question. So in this study, actually, fitness isn't based off of a common standard that's set, I guess, through literature or previous studies, for example. It was really up to the participants of what type of goals they had that they wanted to achieve. For example, some of them wanted to become more, lose weight, become more strong, for example. So they focused on strength training or cardio. Some of them wanted to focus on their gait or their balance. So they focused on neuromotor balance activities or flexibility, for example. So throughout the study, it was encouraged that participants it's up to them what they wanted to do and their comfort level. So for example, when I've looked at the data in terms of the exercise logs or the coaching logs, I've seen that everyone really varies in terms of how they have progressed throughout the 25-week period. And in terms of also preferences, I've seen overall very keen interest in aerobic and resistance activities when it came to the data. However, everyone had their different choices, and it was up to the participants in terms of if they wanted to do a group activity, wanted to do individual activities. Because they had a YMCA membership that was available to them throughout the intervention phase, it was purely up to them of what they did. That included like swimming, for example. They could take part in a for example, cycling with a group or do it separately. So it was really up to them. And I think that was very important to consider because HIV is an episodic disability. There are days where you feel you're 100%, days where you're at your lowest. So we wanted to make sure we were considerate of that and also consider people's times because sometimes, if you're working a couple jobs, for example, it might be really hard to fit in an exercise session or be committed to the program. So it was up to them of when they came to the YMCA or did their exercises. But at the same time, they had to attend a weekly session with the YMCA coach once a week. That was 90 minutes. So that was just that was the minimum we asked in terms of their engagement. But other than that, it was really up to them of what they did during the sessions.
Thank you, Nivetha. That was very good. This question is for Dr. Kajara and Dr. Matusiak. What is one change you would like to recommend be made in healthcare services and practice based on your research? And how might we collaboratively advocate for these changes?
That's a very good question. There are so many things that I think I would like to change. And maybe Christine can also answer as well. I think the thing that I find frustrating, I think, is maybe one of the biggest barriers to care of sickle cell patients is, as a consultant, maybe seeing patients who are on internal medicine, when you tell somebody that they have a sickle cell patient, you often see like a tensing and this sense of frustration, and the physician is almost steeling themselves to go in. So if there's anything that I would like to, understand better and perhaps change one day is the attitudes and the emotions around treating patients with sickle cell disease, and hopefully address these in the future.
Yeah, I think I'll add that I think there's a lot of fear around pain management in general. And in this specific situation, there is a lot of fear because as internal medicine residents, we may not be accustomed to seeing a young woman who, weighs 100 pounds, who is requiring very high doses of opiates, for example. That really scares people, and out of fear, but also out of good intent, they often will want to pull back or hold back on pain management, or they just really don't know how to approach it. So ultimately, what we would like to do is empower internal medicine residents and of course other practitioners caring for these patients to feel comfortable managing pain. And obviously, ultimately, that's really about providing good patient care. I myself will be doing some intensive training at CAMH with one of the pain specialists in sickle cell during my fellowship. And I think that really just speaks to how subspecialized this pain management is. And, you know, that's why we're very interested in finding a way to trickle that down into a wider spread education for the residents who are on the front line taking care of these patients.
Thank you for those answers. Just to follow up on that, how are you attempting to recruit the internal medicine residents who may have had a difficult or challenging experience to not bias and mask an overly positive outlook based on what you've just answered?
That's a good question. So in terms of sampling, we I think that for the time being, we plan to sort of purposely sample residents that we know. So it'll be through, you know, understanding who is on or has been on the internal medicine service, talking to many of the physicians and the staff members. This will be primarily based out of UHN, or specifically Toronto General Hospital. Toronto General Hospital, or the UHN, actually services one of the largest sickle cell or red blood cell disorders in total in actually North America. And so most of the patients come through TGH, and so it'll be through talking to the staff members.
And of course, we're, in terms of the qualitative interviewing, we will not be doing the interviewing ourselves. We'll have a trained research assistant who has no bearing on the residents' advancement within the program, who is not directly involved in patient care, in an effort to create a safer space for residents to discuss their true experiences. And that those interviews will be transcribed and anonymized so that when it gets to the research team, hopefully we can approach it as objectively as possible.
Thank you for that. This question is for Nivedha. How did HIV positive individuals inform your research design and study?
In terms of the design, this was actually, there was a pilot study done before this larger study with, I believe, around less than 50 participants. So using feedback from that study, we had designed the study, and the study was designed by Dr. O'Brien and her team. So I just, you know, I'm doing a secondary analysis, so I joined after the study had initiated and was near the completion phase. But yeah, so it was using a previous study in terms of people living with HIV, and we also had community partners, and it's a participatory action research, so it's based off of the what we came back in terms of feedback from participants. So it was purely based off of previous experiences and informed by people living with HIV and those working in organizations that serve the HIV population in Toronto.
Thank you, Nivedha. I do have a question from a participant who would like to ask Dr. Kadafa and Dr. Matusiak by opening the mic. Would that be okay with you, doctors? Go ahead, Dr. Campos.
I don't think people will be able to unmute themselves. So if it is possible, maybe to have the question typed out.
I think there's an ask to unmute function. I don't know if that works.
Yeah, can you repeat the name and I'll try to see if I can allow them to unmute.
It's Aaron Campos, C-A-M-P-O-S.
Aaron, did that work?
Yeah, I believe so. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, as an internal medicine resident, I'm wondering how you would encourage resident participation in the study without, I guess, you know, perpetuating an idea that the internal medicine residents are not familiar with sort of some of the more complex issues around managing vaso-occlusive episodes, or that internal medicine residents are fearful of managing these patients. I'm also wondering if you've considered expanding the qualitative research to include the other allied health professionals, particularly nursing, since they spend so much more time directly with patients who present with vaso-occlusive episodes. And I find that often, an admission for a vaso-occlusive episode is a very time-consuming process for a nurse who is frequently administering pain medication. I think they would have a very valuable perspective to add as well.
Thank you, Aaron, for those comments. So using our approach, we're very careful with our interview prompts to not bias the resident that we will be interviewing in any particular direction. We plan on talking about, for example, pain medications in a very inductive style where we don't really, we don't really ask them about difficult pain situations per se. We might just ask them about their experiences in general and see where the interview takes us. We've shared a lot of the background here, but the actual interview process will be quite different. And then with regards to your second question, I 100% completely agree. The experiences of social workers, the nurses, even the hospital administrators and ward clerks, not to mention other physicians, pain physicians who are often involved in care of sickle cell patients, hematology physicians, also residents, but also staff members and patients themselves, all incredibly important. And we've sort of debated back and forth amongst the research team whether to include them at this stage or not. But we decided that for simplicity's sake, it will be easier to do internal medicine residents for now and expand further down the line.
Thank you, doctors. And the last question is for Nivedha. Language is very political. For example, many prefer the term living with HIV rather than the terms like HIV positive or suffering with. Why was it important to think about language in how you framed your study?
Well, I think it's important to, when it comes to any condition, not just HIV, that, they're a person and there's more to their identity than their condition. So I guess that's really sparked my interest in exploring the social determinants of health because of the intersectionality of different determinants we face. So for example, I'm a person of color and, I have a certain level of education and, someone even in my own household won't have the same intersections I have that although we live in the same household, right? So just because you live with one condition doesn't necessarily define you. And that is not the only definition of you. And I think that was why it's very important that, I use the term people living with HIV because they are living with it and that's a part of their life, but that's not the only consideration for them. And it's person-centered first. So they're a person first, and then I'm mentioning their condition. So I think that's why it's very important that we use language like that. And sometimes in literature, we do see like HIV positive person and, sometimes the conditions first. And I think it's a great way for us, as we move into the future to start using more people and person-centered language and to understand that just because we're, talking about a certain condition, that is not the focus. It's really the experience and lived experience of the people that are taking part in our study. And also, in our clinic, for example, if it's in a clinical setting or in a community-based setting. So it's the person first, and then whatever research or clinical sort of outcome we're hoping to see from. That's my personal take on that, yeah.
Thank you everyone for the questions and taking the questions from our panelists.
So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the second Block A session. So this block will explore the topics of ageism, health inequities, and resiliency. We again have two presentations for this block, one by Mary Hines and Akshit Pai. As you're listening to these presentations, if you have any feedback for projects that are, still in progress, feel free to kind of write those down on a notepad. We'll be circulating a Google document at the end, and that we can provide that feedback to the presenters for those whose projects aren't yet completed. So please feel free to take notes in that regard. And so thank you to both presenters for joining us today. Mary, you're welcome to share your screen and take it away as soon as you're ready to go.
Did you want to just read the
Oh,
bio, Scott?
right. Yeah, sorry. Totally forgot that. So Mary Hines is an older adult student in the second year of the MSc program of MSc portion of her program at the Institute of Medicine. And Akshit Pai is pursuing his Master's of Science in the Institute of Medical Science at the University of Toronto. His graduate project focuses on the impact of health inequities on childhood stroke care in Ontario. And now you're able to take it away, Mary.
Thank you. Am I being heard?
Yes. Thank
Okay, fine. Okay. Most people will age and thus face ageism. So it is often an added form of oppression. Ageism is most obvious in comics, greeting cards, comedy routines, and media. But it also shows up in medicine and healthcare. Wait a minute, how did I get ahead of myself? Somehow I skipped the introduction, but that's okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is research and drug trials. As you're all familiar, AstraZeneca has had a great deal of difficulty because it was not tested initially on people over 65. And here's an article that I came across where they talk about they were actually using older adults. However, they stopped at 75. So what happens to people who are over 75? No research. This is another common drug that's used for acid reflux or GERD. Sandoz puts this pantoprazole. Never mind, you can read it. Anyway, they found that all elderly subjects, and that means 64 to 76. So someone who is in their 60s or 70s has now become elderly. So you'll notice that in many studies, they talk about geriatric or elderly patients when they're really talking about people who are still quite vibrant. And here you'll see how so-called elderly people are being excluded from clinical trials because of their age. So this particular article on the right mentions that was a thorough study that showed that there were very few trials of older adults. As well, because older adults frequently have comorbidities, they are often excluded from research. And this is a particular table of exclusion criteria, and you'll notice 81% of the trials excluded comorbidities. And they have a whole list here of what they were, but the point is they're excluding comorbidities, and that means they're excluding older adults. In this case, they were excluding 38% of over 65, but also 81% with comorbidities. So that means a lot of older adults are not being considered. People 50 to 80 years old are frequently not mentioned in research. Now at the doctor's office, there are many areas of exclusion or ageism that appears. For instance, doctors, something called polypharmacy, which means that some patients can have as many as 25 different medications. And of course, in many cases, they will counteract each other. So that's a difficulty. People are sometimes treated based solely on their age. And in other cases, they're not treated at all because they're old and therefore they're not expected to live long. And another problem that happens is they're not even talked about. If they bring a partner or they bring a caregiver to the meeting, they are not even talked about. And I noticed at U of T, you can't even study gerontology except after you have your degree. In the community, everyone knows what's happening with long-term care, so I won't even go into that. But there's also the fact that physio for older adults is frequently limited to very basic functioning. I had knee replacements and they wanted me to be able to get in and out of a tub and be able to get in and out of a car and said, now you're fine, go home. I wanted to be able to do rock climbing. That was not one of the things they were looking at. And when you do take classes during the day, the instructor who teaches you the course is usually very young and svelte and very able to do all sorts of things that you can't do, and that leaves you out. So I came up with an idea to help older adults be able to manage most of their own health. And it's older adults self-managing their health risks through SMART goal setting. So the first thing I did was I looked at the health risks that older adults face that can lead to dementia or heart disease. And there are at least 9, there are actually more than that, there's 12, but this is 9 of the more substantial ones. And so you'll see there are many different areas to worry about. But if you go to the doctor's office and you say, I want to be healthier, the doctor could say, well, lose weight, stop smoking, and get more active. Well, that's way too many things to do at once. So what I looked at is, can we look at SMART goals? What concrete steps can you take? How will you measure progress? What actions will you take? Is this something you can actually do? And can you do this action in the time period? So I came up with a very short 1-month study. And what I looked at was initially 11 older adults, 10 finished the study, 55 years of age and older in 2 groups. I thought they would be choosing from exercise, diet, social interaction, and cognitive activity, since those were things you could actually work on in 1 month. Instead, I had one person saying, well, I want to do smoke less. And I thought, well, okay, that was kind of an aha moment for me. So having just these few ideas, these super 6 or whatever, would not be enough. But if you notice some of the things people said as their results, 8 out of 10 reported progress. I had people saying, I'm happy, it's blue sky. I didn't take weights to the cottage, so I did other things, part of my new lifestyle, and I'm not so tired anymore. So these are a couple of the things that people told me at the end of their 1-month trial. So I have come up with a major project that's going to expand on that. So I am looking at creating a workshop, participant workshops for older adults online, since COVID is around, and I'll be recruiting people from across Ontario. So they'll come to Shine, they will learn about SMART goal setting, they will set a goal, they'll create their first goal, they'll come back in 1 month to the group and report on how they've done. They might say, oh, I'm happy with what I've done. I want to keep working on it. I want to lose more weight, or I want to eat more carrots, or whatever the specific goal is that they came up with. And so they might continue the same goal, but they may also modify it. They may say, well, now I'm happy that I'm eating carrots. I'd like to add some green vegetables to my diet. And that might be their new goal. Or they might come up with something totally separate and say, okay, I've been working on exercise. I've done enough of that. I really would like to look at how my diet is going. So that's where they might change their goal. And they'll do this for 6 months. So it'll be cyclical. And they will do that for 5 additional meetings. Why is this important? Well, the projected results are older adults will be empowered by knowing they can have agency in their health. And it's an example of older adults being involved at all stages, because this is an entirely older adult created program for older adults with older adults. Older adults practicing a method to make personal lifestyle changes and possibly follow through lifelong risk reduction behaviors. So my goal is not just to do a study and say, thank you very much, goodbye. So I'm hoping that there'll be a continuation of the program. And what I'm hoping to do is to recruit new leaders, new people to run groups from the groups that I am running in the first place. So the plan is to have a snowball effect. And I'm hoping in the long run that this can be continued with the provincial government. For instance, the Ontario government now has falls prevention classes available everywhere almost. So I'm hoping to be able to do this and continue it in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Mary. So we'll take questions again at the end of both presentations. So for this next presentation, actually, you're welcome to begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Yep. Okay, do you see the presentation, like the title slide?
Yes. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. I'll just minimize the screen. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Akshat, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm a first-year master's candidate in the Children's Stroke Program at SickKids. Today, I will talk about my master's study, which is titled Impact of Health Inequities on the Acute Management and Outcomes of Stroke During Childhood. In this presentation, I'll first start off with giving you some background information about the subject. Second, I'll transition into my study. And finally, I'll summarize the key points and some implications of my study for you. So in both adults and children, stroke can be classified by the underlying cause. It can either be ischemic, which is due to blood clot, or hemorrhagic, which is due to bleeding. So in adult stroke patients who live in the western side of the world, arterial ischemic strokes make up 85% of the cases. But for children, that stats may not be true, because in children, about 55% of the strokes are ischemic, whereas the other 45% have a hemorrhagic cause. And the reported annual incidence of childhood AIS ranges from 1.2 to 7.9 for 100,000 children, but this number increases drastically to 1 per 2,500 to 4,000 in the neonatal population. Some common risk factors that for childhood AIS include congenital heart disease, sickle cell anemia, and arteriopathies. And some common clinical features include focal or generalized seizures, visual field and speech deficits, and reduced level of consciousness, amongst others. Overall, childhood stroke is one of the top 10 causes of death and a common cause of short and long-term disabilities in children. Specifically, childhood AIS can be associated with death in 12%, decreased quality of life in over 50%, and disability in over 60% of the survivors. It can cause deficits in the sensory motor, cognitive, social, and behavioral domains of their lives. In terms of the monetary value, the economic burden of childhood stroke on the families and the health services has been reported. A 2010 study looked at the 5-year medical cost of neonatal and childhood stroke, and they found out that the 5-year medical cost was estimated to be $110,000 US, and this number is 15 times more as compared to the healthy controls. Another study, albeit a more recent one in 2015, actually found out that the higher stroke costs correlate with more severe impairment and poorer quality of life. So based on those medical costs, one can easily extrapolate that the societal cost of a child having short and long-term disabilities would be much more than the $110,000 US. So along with the location and size of the clot, the time to diagnosis is crucial when it comes to stroke. In children, it can be the difference between mild and severe deficits. But there is another factor that affects post-stroke outcomes, and these are the social determinants of health. Social determinants of health, or SDOH for short, are the non-medical factors that determine a person's health outcomes. These include, for example, the household income, parental education, the number of people in the child's family, etc. So in 2015, a study found a robust association between low SES and incidence of AIS in children. And just a reminder, AIS stands for arterial ischemic stroke. So in this study, they looked at only one SES marker, which was the vaccination uptake rates, and they correlated that to be a higher SES or better access to care. So in a follow-up study in 2018, by the same group of researchers, they expanded the question to 3 SES markers. And this time they looked at the maternal education level, rural residence, and household income. So they looked at these 3 SES markers to investigate the association between low SES and worse neurologic outcomes at 1 year post-stroke. They reported that very low income increased the risk of worse outcomes by more than 3 times. So for example, if your family was in the low income tax bracket, then your child is 3 times more likely to have a worse 1-year neurological outcome after suffering an ischemic stroke. And also, children within this income group were more likely to present with a decreased level of consciousness. So that's where my study comes in. We'll be using a much more holistic tool, which is the SDOH, in order to study health inequities that may exist in childhood stroke care at the provincial level. And the overall purpose of my study is to determine the impact of regional health inequities on the time to diagnosis, management, and outcomes of childhood arterial ischemic stroke patients, and this would be limited at sick kids for now. So basically my study has 3 parts. So the first part is health equity, second is the delay measures, and finally is the outcome measures. So in this study, the health inequities will be looked at through the lens of marginalization. Specifically, we'll be using the Ontario Marginalization Index, or as people usually call it, the ON marge. The ON marge is essentially a tool that measures marginalization across our province. But before I go further, I just want to define what marginalization is. So marginalization, as per the Public Health Ontario, is a systemic process by which individuals and groups are prevented from fully participating in society. And the barriers that people face are within the umbrella of the 4 dimensions shown here. The 4 dimensions include material deprivation, residential instability, ethnic concentration, and dependency. The study aims are shown here. So first, we'll be evaluating the association between the ON marge dimensions and delayed diagnosis. The second aim is that we will be evaluating the association between ON marge dimensions and the 1-year neurological outcomes. And finally, we're hoping to explore the impact of delayed diagnosis on the 1-year neurological outcome measures. And for the study, my study team came up with 3 hypotheses. The first one is essentially that higher marginalization will be significantly correlated with delayed diagnosis. Second is that high marginalization will be correlated with worse neurological outcomes 1 year from diagnosis. And finally, there will be a significant association between delayed diagnosis and worse 1-year neurological outcome. So just to summarize, as a first of its kind study that focuses on health equity, delay measures, and outcome in childhood stroke, I envision that the future of stroke care will be changed for the better. And during a time when the impact of equity, diversity, and inclusion on healthcare outcomes is more apparent than ever, there's an urgent need to pursue this study. And once we figure out what barriers patients are facing across our province, we can address them by advocating for more patient-centric care and inclusive policies which will impact thousands, if not millions of families across Canada. And with that, I'd like to finish my presentation and kindly thank you all for your attention.
Oh my God, I just realized I wasn't speaking the entire time or I didn't have my volume on. So thank you again for your presentation, Akshat. We'll hand it over to Kajani to moderate the Q&A again.
Hi, thank you again, Mary and Akshat, for your presentations. This is a comment for Mary made by one of our attendees. This sounds like an incredible way to both empower folks who are often deliberately excluded from research and lumped into a single category and actively dismantling systems that attempt to remove agency from folks of older ages. So thank you, Mary. And this is a question for Akshat. The concept of structural determinants of health that Dr. Nanki Rai often points to asks us to focus on root causes of inequities, forms of oppression such as classism, racism, ageism, and otherwise. How do you think the structural determinants of health or forms of oppression have contributed to the inequities your research projects aim to address?
Would you like me to go first and answer the question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think honestly, based on the Ontario Marginalization Index, it's a tool that looks at, it's like a cross-sectional tool. So it looks at the census data from 2006, 2011, and 2015. While it is cross-sectional, it does look at the data at the neighborhood level. So, so I looked into the data on the Public Health Ontario website, which is publicly accessible for everyone. And once you go in there, you can see that there are neighborhoods that are color-coded within the 4 dimensions that I showed before. And based on all the multi-dimensional factors that they looked at during those 3 cross-sectional years, there are some trends that have continued throughout the time. And then there are some trends that have gone a bit better in terms of like shifting a neighborhood or like many neighborhoods from an area towards a high SES status, high socioeconomic status, or there have been, on the flip side, there have been some negative findings, whereas high SES neighborhoods have transformed into moderate to low SES neighborhoods. So this kind of talks to the trends across Canada and across Ontario as well. where there has been changes between 2006 and 2016. And just a reminder, like those are the only three like data sets that we have access to. So like with the limited data that we do have access to, those are the three years that we will be looking at in our study. And we will scrutinize everything that we find in our data set. And it will be linked to the 350 patients that are currently eligible at SickKids. So we'll be looking at all the different factors that do contribute to the continued oppression between 2006 to 2016. I hope that answers the person's question.
Can I go now? My turn?
Go ahead, Mary. Thank you.
So two things. First, before I do this study, what I'm working on right now is a survey across Ontario, and it'll be distributed through community health centers, which means that it's across all of Ontario because there are community health centers across the entire province, and they tend to have a population, a clientele that often are of various disabilities, various indigeneity, people who have lower socioeconomic status. So I would hope to get a fairly good cross-representation, both of the survey and later I'll be recruiting from the same database, the same group to create patients, to get participants for my actual study. So I'm hoping to get a relatively good cross-section. My only drawback is because of COVID, I'm going to end up having to use the internet, which means there's going to be some limitation for people with limited internet access. I'm hoping that if COVID has actually abated a bit, that people will be able to make use of computers and such that are often found in community health centers and in public libraries. Because the idea is for people to come together once a month in groups to discuss their goals and their plans and what they want to change and how they want to live. And of course, ageism is just one more thing added to many people's other difficulties. I mean, being a woman and older, there's already 2 areas. If you're Black, that's 3. If you're Black and disabled, that's 4. If you happen to be Black, Indigenous, disabled, a woman, and older, you have many, many different cross-sectionalities that are affecting your life. So all of these things will be a factor, but I'm not disaggregating the research part. I will be disaggregating the information I get from the survey, but I will not be disaggregating the information from the people who participate in the actual research study. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mary. This is a question for both presenters. Are you both able and willing to share some of the exclusion and inclusion criteria related to age and other social determinants that you have decided to have within your studies and how you came to select them?
I could speak first if you like. Basically, the only exclusion is that you have to be 55 and able to give consent. So therefore, you have to basically say, no, I'm competent enough to make my own decisions. So that's really the only basic areas.
Thank you, Neha.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good evening. My partner, Mona Khalid, and myself, Anoop Begbedi, are here today to present our Health and Safety Initiative, the ACB COVID-19 Public Awareness Initiative. So I will first be going over the introduction, which includes the background, rationale, and objectives. Black individuals in Toronto have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, representing 23% of those who tested positive, despite being only 9% of Toronto's population. In order to effectively spread awareness of relevant COVID-19 services and messages, we need to contact and partner with key communities. So successful culturally relevant health promotion requires recognition of key community needs, barriers, and opportunities for collaboration. While the pandemic led to a necessary surge in public safety messaging and services in Toronto, the inclusiveness and cultural relevance of these resources to the Black community has been limited. For example, at the time the ACB COVID-19 Public Awareness Initiative was formed, out of 27 posters on the City of Toronto website, 0 had representation in Native African languages, and only 2 had Black representation. Ultimately, the lack of messaging to address social inequalities and specifically reach the ACB community in Toronto created the need for culturally specific supports developed with Black community organizations for the Black community. So we established this initiative to address this health information gap and provide culturally appropriate messaging and resources for Black Canadians in Toronto. Our work was grounded in collaboration with community members of different social and educational backgrounds, including 5 Black youth and 3 Black community partners from BHA, Black CAP, and with the financial support of the CABR unit at the City of Toronto. So our objectives were to increase awareness and uptake of public safety measures to protect the Black community from COVID-19 using social media campaigns and in-person outreach, to expand awareness of social services available during the pandemic and recovery via resource lists, and to support Black youth to engage with meaningful peer mentorship and leadership opportunities that serve their communities during COVID-19.
So there were 6 key steps taken to achieve our objectives, and we'll take you through each of them. So step 1 was team meetings. Since May of last year, regular Zoom meetings between Black community partners, representatives, and youth were held to identify emerging issues experienced by ACB communities. After picking a topic, youth on the team would then conduct research to find relevant public health recommendations and resources. Step 2, developing culturally inclusive prompts. So based on the topic the team decided to conduct research on, prompts were created to help encapsulate and introduce the topic. So for example, Black Parents Matter was a prompt used to promote our Black parental wellness campaign. These prompts were then included into the graphics to introduce the topic that recommendations were ultimately going to be based on. Step 3 was designing graphics. So graphics were designed by a community-based designer, and illustrations and photos of Black individuals were intentionally included to promote representation. Step 4 was creating resource lists. So resources with a specific focus on those provided by Black-led and Black-serving community organizations were compiled into a shareable, non-editable Google document, and these were circulated alongside the graphics. Step 5, reviewing the infographics and resources with the team. So graphics and resources were analyzed by the entire team at these weekly Zoom meetings, and feedback was then incorporated for quality control before finally launching the graphics and the resources. And the final step was outreach. So 2 primary methods were used to distribute information to ACB communities. So firstly, through social media release, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook with paid advertising were used to share the infographics. And we also relied on various community health centers and physicians to share the graphics. Secondly, we also relied on in-person outreach by Black CAP harm reduction team, specifically for our harm reduction campaign. So a trained team of outreach workers would circulate flyers to clients using harm reduction services. And workers also posted these flyers in public spaces, such as community boards, for access by the general public.
So our results were as followed. Over 20,000 followers across partner social media platforms, 2,200 views, likes, and comments across social media platforms, 2,000 flyers distributed for our harm reduction campaign on safe drug use during COVID-19, 50 Black families served by Black CAP and National African Integration and Families Association were provided with support kits and backpacks with grocery store gift cards, masks, sanitizer, sunscreen, and school supplies. 9 campaigns, including 16 professionally designed graphics on food insecurity, student supports, parental supports, COVID-19 misconceptions, public safety measures, and safe drug use during the COVID-19 pandemic. And 4 comprehensive resource lists to support food security, Black mental health, student financial supports, and Black parents.
So as we're experiencing the second wave of COVID-19 and amidst the rollout of vaccinations, there's a need to prioritize the intentional representation of Black individuals and Black community needs in public safety promotion materials. So our recommendations ultimately include holding public health departments, health organizations, and other stakeholders accountable to identify current gaps in their own public safety messaging, involving Black community organizations and representatives as longitudinal partners to provide insight into effective messaging, engaging ACB groups, including Black youth, as assets in this process with compensation, prioritizing the distribution of emotional, social, and financial supports to the ACB population, and lastly, using innovative platforms to connect with different demographics, including social media and collaborations with community organizations. So this is all to say that a wide variety of methods need to be considered to address the health disparities and the emotional suffering that have burdened Black Canadians during the COVID-19 pandemic. And prioritizing Black community insights into public health messaging will help provide life-saving measures that will ultimately protect our ACB communities here in Toronto.
So we'd just like to take a few seconds to give our acknowledgements to our partners. We'd like to acknowledge our project manager, Chantel Phillips. We'd like to acknowledge our community advisors, Paul Bailey from Black Health Alliance, Cassandra Smith for Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention, and Lucy Nairwai, our community development worker. And we'd also like to acknowledge our student animators, Mona Khalid, myself, Anak Bagberei, Anu Papula, and Lena Alfaki. Thank you.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I think I speak for both my colleagues and I that we are very humbled to be in this space. And it's just, we were talking about this earlier, we just feel like we want to stay within the space forever. It's so nice connecting with people who have the same views and want to see the same sort of change happening in the world. So we're very humbled to be here. My name is Zara, and I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
My name is Anoli, and I use she, her pronouns.
And my name is Madeline. I use she, her pronouns.
Thank you. And I also use she, her pronouns. So we are looking forward to sharing our experiences co-founding our student club Unlearn here today. So we created Unlearn as a collaborative learning space for us and our occupational therapy peers to really dig deeper and unearth the blind spots in our perspectives when it comes to issues or experiences related to equity and diversity. But our approach is a little bit different than the traditional, more didactic style of teaching and learning. So I will now pass it on to Madeline to talk to us about why we created a little student group.
Thank you, Zara. So to introduce the reason we created Unlearn, I invite you all to take part in a brief activity with me. Open another tab on your computer and search the words University of Toronto Professor in Google Images. And then scroll through some of the images you see. I'm going to pause for a moment just to give you some time to do this. So take a moment to look through the images you see. What kind of pictures do you see? What I saw was a largely white group of people who look like me. We started Unlearn because we were noticing that the people who design and teach our curriculum, the people who make important decisions at an institutional level, are mainly white individuals. As a white settler, I acknowledge that I benefit from having a makeup of professors who look like me, while this simultaneously acts as a form of oppression for many of my peers. Zara, Anoli, and I started Unlearn as a space to dig into these topics of privilege and oppression on a deeper level than we would get to in class. We wanted to create a space where we could talk about our experiences, explore our assumptions and biases, and learn from each other. Now I'll be handing it off to Zara, who will be talking about how we navigate these peer-based discussions.
So we as co-founders of our club really wanted to utilize this idea of show rather than tell when it came to exploring equity and diversity related topics, and use guided discovery to help our peers become actively involved in their anti-oppression learning. So for this reason, we weave activities through our session that encourage reflection rather than approaching these issues from solely a very academic perspective. So we do end up sharing information, relevant information on the topics we explore for each of our sessions, but they are provided as part of the discussion as a debrief to the activities we use, and then a resource list we share at the end of our events. But we really wait for our peers to formulate their own reflections and ideas about the topic being discussed first. What we've come to realize is that sometimes academically looking at the history of things like oppression, colonialism, and racism can feel like this is something that has happened in the past, but by using our peers' narrative and by foregrounding the narratives of our own classmates in these spaces, we hope to push people from that idea of, oh, look how far we've come and how much progress we've made, to look at how far we actually have to go in terms of enacting change. So we wanted to share the burden or power of collective organization with all of our peers and not have a few select students responsible for everyone else's learning and unlearning. I remember in one of our EDI-related lectures, one of our guest panelists shared how we've become too focused on passing the mic back and forth when it comes to talking about these issues, but we are not really thinking about the people who turn off or are not listening to these individuals from marginalized and minority groups. And often it is these people who are not listening who are in positions of power to influence change. So for us, Unlearn had to become the student group that attracted the interest of both kinds of individuals. This is why inviting curiosity through reflective activities and using that show versus tell approach has given us an audience of peers with very diverse values, beliefs, and political affiliations. And together we can begin to have a productive conversation and commitment to learning and growth. So we are really built on that peer learning model. And the hope is that eventually it won't be just the three of us taking the lead on learning sessions, because it won't be authentic. And we didn't want to speak over the voices of other students who have experiences they want to share and if they're willing to take a lead on facilitating this learning. So we shared a list of topics at the beginning of the year with their peers or classmates, and they could sign up to attend sessions as either participants or be involved in actually creating and leading those sessions. And that way we just play the facilitator role, helping with the administrative tasks, and maybe coming up with activities around those topics, whereas our peers become sort of the leaders in facilitating this learning. So in this way, if we go back to our previous analogy, our peers are the ones holding the mic and leading the learning, while other people in the audience start to listen when in the past they have been resistant to do so in a purely academic lecture style setting. So it wouldn't be Unlearn if we didn't get you involved with the learning in our presentation. So I'm now going to pass it on to Anuli to lead us through the next part of this, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Zara. So to further demonstrate how Unlearn facilitates these interactive group activities, we will do a short activity today. So for this section, I encourage everyone to change to the gallery view setting if you're not on it already, as it will make the experience a lot more meaningful. So for this activity, I will be reading out a series of statements, and after each one, I will take a short pause. And if the sentence applies or relates to you, then I want you to either raise your hand if you're on camera, or you can use the react function on Zoom to either raise your hand or react to the sentence. So for example, if I were to say, I am a student at U of T, then you would raise your hand and then you would put it down. Does that make sense to everyone? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, thank you. So we can begin the activity. My professors look like me. When I learn about scars, it is on skin that is the same color as mine. I do not fear that my professors will misgender me in class. I do not fear that my clients will perceive me as less competent based on my appearance. I am able to take days off school or work for festivals that I celebrate. I have a quiet and private environment at home to work in during the pandemic. I feel comfortable advocating about anti-racism without fearing repercussions such as discrimination and racist remarks. I do not fear being discriminated against by preceptors on placement. I feel comfortable speaking up in class because I have not had experiences of being judged for the way that I speak. And this activity has made me consider things that I would not have considered before. Okay, thank you everyone for participating in this activity. I'm loving the engagement. So normally we would debrief as a group after the activity and have a little discussion. But here we will encourage self-reflection, as a lot of the time the onus is on BIPOC students to educate others. But self-reflection can really foster a space where learning and conversation can happen from each and every individual. And so now I'll pass it back to Zara.
So this kind of brings us towards the end of the discussion, but we thought we would share some of the topics that were really popular with our peers. So we definitely try to explore the power and use of language in different spaces. I think it's things we don't usually think about. Even the word inclusion, the first time I had this realization, I bring it up in every session, that implies that there's someone in this authority position who's allowing us to integrate. And so we try to even refrain from using the word inclusion in our work, looking at mental health and personal lived experiences, intersecting identities and how that impacts a person's mental health, both positively or negatively. And our upcoming session is on intersectional feminism. So we have tons of activities and visual components involved. We're really excited to present this during International Women's History Month. So if you're interested in joining us for that session, send us a message. Our information is right over here. So send us a message and we will share the details of this session with you. But thank you so much for your participation and your engagement today. That's all.